I was exploring the possibilities of a WWII where Britain withdrew from the war in 1940 for any one of several possible reasons. Perhaps this is because Churchill is not around to build British resolve, or because the Dunkirk evacuation ends in disaster, so Germany and Britain sign an armistice. Britain retains its empire and naval control of the world's oceans. This is not a very original starting point, but bear with me. The German campaigns in the Balkans and Greece still happen and are still successful. Germany still launches Operation Barbarossa in 1941 on the same schedule, but with some gains on the margins by not having the Luftwaffe suffer attrition from the Battle of Britain. However, let's assume that this is not enough to change the material outcome. Even if Leningrad, Moscow, or Stalingrad fall, the USSR has already relocated a large share of its industrial base east of the Urals and holds the line in the winter of 1941-42 thanks to overextended German supply lines and the existential nature of the fight. Japan still attacks Pearl Harbor on deck. 1941, dragging the US into the war. Germany still declares war on the US. At this point, the US is still economically aligned with Britain. Germany attacks trade in the Atlantic Ocean, but little else can happen because there are no bases close to Europe that the US can use to launch a D-Day style invasion. Iceland, North Africa, and the Middle East are all unsuitable candidates. Germany is at the zenith of conquest, and Britain views hosting American forces as unnecessarily risky. The American public is enthusiastic towards defeating Japan as in our timeline, but has little interest in an intervention in Europe due to prevailing isolationist politics. With Britain out of the war and reluctant to get dragged back in, the US cannot use it as a launching pad for opening a theater in Western Europe, and the USSR alone continues fighting Germany. America not fighting Germany frees up resources like bombers, intelligence, and shipbuilding for the Pacific theater, but the main bottleneck for making progress in the Pacific was not lack of resources. It was how quickly a navy and supply logistics could be stood up. Having more scale would have been helpful, but it would not have accelerated the timeline towards Japan's defeat very quickly. But what about the Manhattan Project? It was motivated first and foremost by fear that Germany would acquire a superweapon. Although it officially started in early 1942, nuclear weapons were a consideration as early as 1939, starting with the Einstein-Shillard letter. If the US is not actively fighting Germany, then investing tons of resources in that moonshot project makes less sense. The Manhattan Project still happens, but with less urgency and funding. In Eastern Europe, the USSR has been gaining ground back from Germany. Germany's maximum advance was somewhat deeper than in our timeline. The Soviet counter-advance is meaningfully slower. Because Lend-Lease in 1942-1944 is much more scaled down, Germany is not. Facing strategic bombing from Britain and the US, and fewer German resources are spent garrisoning France or fighting in North Africa or Italy. However, the structural factors of deeper Soviet manpower, land, industry, and energy still push the outcome towards USSR victory. In early 1944, it's apparent to Britain and the US that the USSR will eventually win. Allied leaders realize that if they don't take land from Germany themselves, the USSR will conquer the entire continent. This is a much more compelling justification to the American public for a European war. The Allied D-Day invasion force quietly starts massing in the British Isles, much like in real life, just delayed. The Manhattan Project accelerates. By mid-1945, Japan is economically strangled and on the brink of collapse, much like the real timeline. However, the atomic bomb is still 1-2 years away from completion. The US invades the Japanese islands in a bloody but short campaign. Japan surrenders in late 1945. Also in mid-1945, D-Day is launched, opening a Western front against Germany. It's clear to German commanders that the war is lost, so resistance against the Allied forces is half-hearted. However, the fighting on the Eastern Front remains vicious because the Soviets are notorious for poorly treating prisoners. By early 1946, most of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands have been captured, and the Soviets are most of the way through Poland. Stalin, having led the USSR through the vast majority of the work of defeating Germany, is furious that the Allies are swooping in at the last minute to take land from Germany when it's at its weakest. Unlike in real life, there are no equivalents of the Yalta, Malta, or Tehran conferences, and therefore no framework for governing post-war Europe. The USSR captures Berlin in mid-1946, ending the war. They control slightly more German territory than in the real timeline. The Manhattan Project continues, reaching a viable weapon in early 1947. The USSR, from captured German scientists and espionage in the West, attain a nuclear weapon a year later. American nuclear monopoly lasts for only a year instead of 4. There are a few big differences relative to the real-life outcome of WWII. No nuclear taboo has developed, since nuclear weapons have not been used in warfare yet. First use would likely happen tactically in the next major regional war, like Korea or a Central Europe. The Cold War starts early because of the Allied land grab strategy decimated trust between Western Europe and the USSR. The Eastern European theater had more death and destruction. Because the war was more prolonged, the Western European theater had less. No invasion of Italy. Remaining the same. The Marshall Plan still happened, since its strategic impetus, rebuilding to forestall communism, remains. There's little appetite for a Western Soviet war in the aftermath. Better to rebuild and rearm.